It's 7 a.m. This ship sails at 4 p.m. today. Right now, none of the food for the next 7 days, for 6,000 passengers and over 2,000 crew, has been loaded yet. Before this ship leaves at 4 p.m., more than 300,000 pounds of food and drink must be delivered, inspected, and stored in exactly the right place. Not roughly by tonight. Not, we'll catch up tomorrow. If the ship isn't ready, it still leaves the dock on schedule, fully booked, whether the galley is stocked or not. The strangest part? This isn't a crisis. This is Tuesday. This exact 9-hour sprint happens on this ship and every ship like it, once every 7 days for the entire year, in dozens of ports around the world, without fail. A cruise ship isn't a floating hotel. It's a 9-hour deadline that resets itself every single week. And the moment it's missed even once, there is no grocery store to run to. The nearest resupply is 3 days away, in the middle of the ocean. Before we get into the numbers, it helps to understand that cruise ship isn't one category of logistics problem. It's 3, stacked on top of each other. There's the mega ship, the Symphony of the Seas class, carrying 6,000 to 7,000 passengers plus over 2,000 crew. This is industrial-scale catering, dozens of separate kitchens, hundreds of chefs, and a supply chain that behaves more like a small country's food distribution network than a restaurant. There's the mid-size premium ship, a few thousand passengers, fewer venues, but a much higher standard per plate. This is where specialty dining and personalized menus start to matter, and the provisioning has to be far more precise because there's less room for waste to hide. And there's the small luxury or expedition ship, sometimes under 1,000 passengers, going to places, Antarctica, remote fjords, where there is no port to resupply at all for a week or more. Smaller numbers, but the hardest logistics problem of the 3, because if they get the math wrong, there is no emergency grocery run possible. 3 very different businesses. Same underlying question. How do you guarantee food for thousands of people, days from the nearest supplier, without ever running out and without wasting so much that it eats the profit margin? Here's the part that should sound impossible the first time you hear it. A large cruise ship completes an entire changeover, every passenger off, every passenger on, every cabin cleaned, all waste removed, all new food loaded, in about 8 to 10 hours. Smaller ships can do it in 6. This happens roughly once a week, sometimes more often for the entire operating life of the ship. In that single window, a big ship can take on somewhere around 300,000 pounds of food and beverage, pallet after pallet moving up dedicated crew-only ramps, inspected by chefs the moment it arrives, and distributed into cold storage, dry pantries, and galleys fast enough that the kitchen is prepping lunch before the first new passenger has even boarded. And there is no flexibility built into that clock. If a delivery truck is late, if a shipment fails a quality check at the gangway, if customs holds a container an extra 90 minutes, that shortfall doesn't get made up next week. It has to be resolved in the hours remaining before the ship physically has to leave the dock, because an idle cruise ship isn't idle. It's losing money every hour it sits there instead of sailing its next paid itinerary. One logistics executive who coordinates these deliveries put it simply: unlike a delivery to a supermarket that can just wait until the next day if it's missed, a missed delivery to a cruise ship means the ship is gone. There is no next day option once it has sailed. Here's the first number that doesn't add up at first. Feeding a passenger and crew member for 1 day costs the cruise line somewhere in the range of $10 to $15 in raw food, a fraction of what you'd guess given the buffet in front of you. But that number is deceptively small because it hides the actual expensive part: keeping thousands of pounds of perishable food at the correct temperature, in the correct compartment, for up to 10 days at sea, without a single freezer failure. A ship carries multiple separate cold storage zones: meat, dairy, produce, seafood, each with its own temperature requirement, because cross-contaminating those zones even slightly can spoil an entire week's supply of one category. If a refrigeration unit fails mid-voyage, there is no calling in a repair truck. The ship's engineers have to fix it at sea with what's on board, while the food inside it is actively losing shelf life by the hour. This is why provisioning teams don't just plan for what passengers will eat. They plan for a reserve percentage above expected consumption, specifically so that a short delay, a rough sea day that cancels a shore excursion and keeps everyone eating on board, or a supply hiccup at the next port doesn't turn into an actual shortage. That reserve costs money sitting in cold storage the whole voyage, whether it gets used or not. Now here's a cost that dwarfs the food bill entirely, and it's the one most people never think about when they picture logistics. Fuel. A large modern cruise ship burns somewhere around 200 to 250 metric tons of fuel a day at cruising speed. At a typical bunker price in the range of $500 to $800 per ton, that's roughly $125,000 to $160,000 a day just to keep the ship moving and its systems running. Lighting, air conditioning, water desalination, and yes, refrigeration for all that food. Slow the ship down and the math changes dramatically. Cutting cruising speed from a fast 24 knots down to a more efficient 18 knots can cut fuel burn by up to 40%. Which means the person planning the ship's route isn't just choosing the prettiest way between islands. They're running a constant trade-off between arriving on schedule and burning tens of thousands of extra dollars a day to do it. And fuel isn't a shop around for the best price purchase. Environmental rules under international maritime law, the sulfur limits set by the IMO, mean ships have to burn specific, more expensive low-sulfur fuel in sensitive coastal zones like the Caribbean, the Baltic, and the waters off North America. Burn the wrong grade in the wrong zone and the ship faces serious regulatory penalties, so the fuel that goes into the tank isn't just a cost, it's a compliance decision made port by port, zone by zone, for the entire itinerary. You'd assume the smart move is to order exactly what passengers will eat, no more, no less, to keep costs tight. That's wrong. And understanding why tells you almost everything about how this business actually thinks. Provisioning teams deliberately overorder. Every voyage carries a buffer above forecasted consumption, because running short at sea is a catastrophic outcome that costs vastly more than modest food waste ever could. A ship that runs low on a category of food mid-voyage has no fallback. It cannot pull into an unscheduled port on a whim. Ports are booked, customs is scheduled, and an unplanned stop can cost far more in disrupted logistics than the food itself was ever worth. So the real strategy isn't minimize waste, it's guarantee zero stockouts, and treat modest waste as the acceptable price of that guarantee. The kitchen would rather throw away a few hundred pounds of surplus produce at the end of a voyage than risk being unable to serve dinner on day 6. Waste, in this business, isn't a failure. It's a deliberately purchased insurance policy. It's just after 6 a.m. on February 10, 2013. The Carnival Triumph is a day into a 4-night cruise out of Texas, 4,000 passengers and crew on board, most of them still asleep. Then, deep in the engine room, a fire breaks out. Crews get it out fast. Nobody is hurt. But the fire has already done the one thing this ship cannot recover from at sea. It's knocked out the main generators. And on a ship like this, the generators aren't just running the lights. They're running everything. The engines, the water system, the kitchens, the refrigeration holding a week's worth of food at exactly the temperature it needs to survive. Within hours, that cold chain, the one thing every provisioning plan is built around, is gone. No backup grocery store, no walking to shore. The Triumph is now adrift in the Gulf of Mexico, roughly 150 miles from land, and the food on board is losing its safety window by the hour. The company's answer is to do the only thing you can do in the middle of the ocean: send help by sea and by air. A second Carnival ship, the Elation, is redirected to physically meet the Triumph and hand off food and supplies. The U.S. Navy flies in cargo planes loaded with Spam, Pop-Tarts, and canned crab meat. For 5 days, passengers wait out the tow back to port on cold sandwiches and rationed meals, sleeping in cabins with no power, while the ship crawls toward Mobile, Alabama, at a few miles an hour. Here's the part worth sitting with. The provisioning team on that ship did everything right. The food was loaded on schedule, inspected, stocked with the usual reserve built in. None of that mattered, because the failure wasn't a supply failure. It was a power failure. And on a ship, food, water, and refrigeration all sit downstream of the same fragile thing: electricity. That's the real lesson buried in Poop Cruise headlines. A cruise ship's food supply isn't really a food problem. It's an engineering dependency problem wearing a food costume. And no amount of extra provisioning reserve can save you from a system failure it was never designed to survive. Let's put real numbers together for one voyage on a large ship, roughly 6,000 passengers and 2,200 crew, over 7 days. Food and beverage, at a working figure of about $12 per person per day across passengers and crew combined, comes out to roughly $8,200 per day, or about $57,000 for the full week. Fuel, at 220 tons a day and $650 a ton, runs about $143,000 a day, or just over $1 million for the week. That comparison alone should reframe how you think about this business. Food, The thing every passenger actually sees in photographs is a rounding error next to fuel, the thing no passenger ever thinks about. The visible cost and the real cost are almost never the same line item. Add crew payroll, port fees, waste disposal. Itself tightly regulated under international MARPOL rules that ban dumping most food waste and plastics near coastlines, and insurance. And you start to see why cruise lines run on razor-thin per-passenger margins even while charging what looks, from the shore, like a lot of money for a ticket. The good voyage. Ports run on schedule. The provisioning window closes on time with no rejected deliveries. Fuel prices sit in the normal $500 to $600 per ton range. Weather cooperates so the captain can run an efficient speed, and the pre-ordered reserve comes in almost exactly matched to what passengers actually eat. Margins on food and fuel stay within the range the line budgeted for the whole season. The bad voyage. A supplier truck is delayed at customs, and the ship sails with a partial shortfall in one category, forcing an expensive emergency resupply arranged through a local backup vendor at a steep markup. A storm forces the captain to run at higher speed to stay on schedule, spiking fuel burn by tens of thousands of dollars in a single day. Bunker fuel prices tick up with the broader oil market. None of this is a disaster on the scale of the Triumph. No headlines, no rescue helicopters. But stacked together, it can swing a single voyage's operating cost by 6 figures, quietly, with passengers never noticing a thing beyond maybe a slightly thinner buffet line on the last night. That's the real risk in this business, not the dramatic failures. The quiet, compounding ones that never make the news but show up every time in the numbers. A cruise ship was never really a hotel that floats. It's a 7-day countdown, running on a fuel budget bigger than its food budget, betting that nothing breaks before the next port. Because out here, there is no next-day delivery.